I still remember the moment I stepped off the bus that day, telling myself over and over, I'm finally going home. I'm finally going back to Emma. My hands were shaking badly as I carried my worn-out bag, and I kept whispering, just stay strong. Just a few more steps, and you'll see her again. The air felt different, like it knew I was no longer the same man who left 3 years ago. The road to my house felt longer than any battlefield I had survived. I kept thinking, she must be waiting for me right now, smiling like she used to when I left. My heart kept repeating her name like a prayer. Emma, Emma, I'm back. I'm finally home. Every step made me more nervous, but I refused to slow down because I wanted that moment of reunion so badly. When I finally reached the gate, I stopped for a second because something inside me felt wrong. I pushed it open slowly and called out, Mom, I'm home. My voice echoed strangely in the silence. No footsteps, no running hug, just emptiness. I swallowed hard and said again, Is anyone here? My mother came out first, and the look on her face immediately made me suspicious. She said, You came back early. I wasn't expecting you today. I frowned and replied, Early? I completed my duty exactly on time. She nodded quickly, but avoided my eyes, saying, Yes, of course, I just mean it was sudden. Her voice didn't feel normal to me at all. I looked around the house and asked immediately, Where's Emma? She knows I'm coming today. My mother hesitated too long before answering, She is not here right now. I laughed a little, trying to ease my tension, and said, Not here? That's impossible. I told her the exact date. My voice got weaker as I spoke. My Uncle Richard appeared at the door, not looking at me properly. I asked him directly, Uncle, tell me what's going on. Why is everyone acting strange? He replied, You're tired from travel. Just rest first. I stepped closer and said, Don't avoid me. I need answers about Emma. His silence made my anxiety worse. I shook my head and said, No, I don't need rest. I need Emma right now. Where is she hiding? My voice rose louder and sharper. The room went completely silent, and I could feel everyone avoiding my eyes. I repeated, Tell me the truth. My mother grabbed my arm and said, Please calm down. You just got back. I pulled away and said, Don't tell me to calm down. I was risking my life for 3 years, and this is what I come back to? My voice cracked with emotion, but I still stood firm. I tried to convince myself everything was normal. I kept telling myself, she must be outside. She'll come in any moment and surprise me. But no matter how many times I said it, the silence didn't change. I whispered again, Emma, if you're here, please come out. Still nothing. I felt something heavy settle in my chest as I looked around the room one last time. I said softly, Something is wrong. I can feel it in every part of me. And in that moment, I understood that whatever I had left behind 3 years ago was gone forever. I walked slowly inside the house, looking at every corner as if Emma might suddenly appear and smile at me. I said again, This doesn't make sense. Where would she go without telling me? My mother followed behind me and said, Please sit down. You just arrived. I replied, I don't want to sit. I want answers. Uncle Richard stayed near the wall, silent, avoiding me completely. My heart was beating fast, and I said, Someone here knows something, and I need the truth right now. My mother looked down and said, It's complicated. I snapped back, Nothing is complicated when it comes to my wife. The room felt even heavier as no one spoke for a few seconds. I took a deep breath and walked toward Emma's room. I said, If she's not here, I'll know immediately. My mother quickly said, Don't go in there. That made me stop instantly. I turned back and asked, Why not? What's inside that room? Uncle Richard finally spoke, Just leave it. I felt anger rise inside me, and I said, If you're hiding something from me, I swear I will find out myself. My mother started crying quietly and said, We didn't want you to come back like this. I asked, Like what? Confused? Hurt? Tell me where Emma is. Uncle Richard finally stepped forward and said, She's not here anymore. I froze and said, What do you mean not here anymore? The silence that followed felt like my entire world breaking apart. I whispered, No, that's not true. My legs felt weak, and I stepped back saying, Emma would never leave without telling me. My voice broke completely, and I looked at everyone, waiting for someone to deny it again, but no one did. I knew my life had truly ended now. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Uncle Richard's voice saying, "She's not here anymore." I sat on the edge of my bed before sunrise, staring at the floor and whispering to myself, Emma would never abandon me. There has to be another explanation. But the fear inside me kept growing stronger. Around noon, I heard a car stop outside the house. My heart immediately raced, and I ran toward the window. The moment I saw Emma step out of the passenger seat, I felt my chest tighten so hard I could barely breathe. I whispered, "She's here. Thank God." I rushed outside before anyone could stop me. "Emma?" I shouted. She froze when she saw me standing there. For 1 second, I expected her to run into my arms, but she didn't move at all. She just stared at me with cold eyes that felt completely unfamiliar. I smiled nervously and walked closer. "I'm finally home," she answered quietly. "Yeah, I know." Her voice sounded distant, almost uncomfortable. I tried to hug her, but she stepped back so fast that my entire body went numb. I looked at her in confusion and asked, "Why are you acting like this?" She crossed her arms and said, "You shouldn't have come without warning." I stared at her. "Without warning? Emma, I told you my return date months ago." She looked away and replied, "Plans change." I couldn't understand what I was hearing. I said softly, "I spent 3 years dreaming about this moment." She stayed silent. The silence hurt more than any insult ever could. Then I noticed the ring on her finger. It sparkled under the sunlight, and my stomach dropped instantly. I grabbed her hand carefully and whispered, "What is this?" She quickly pulled her hand away. "It's just a ring." "That's not our wedding ring," I said. Before she could answer, Uncle Richard walked toward us and interrupted. "You just came back. Don't start creating problems already." I turned toward him angrily. "This has nothing to do with you." He stepped closer to Emma and said, "She doesn't owe you an explanation right now." The way he stood beside her made my skin crawl. I looked back at Emma and asked, "Since when does he speak for you?" Emma sighed heavily. "Please don't make this harder." "Harder?" I shouted. "You're wearing another man's ring and treating me like a stranger?" My mother suddenly appeared near the door and said nervously, "Please lower your voice." I laughed bitterly. "No one here wants to tell me the truth." Emma rubbed her forehead and said, "You don't understand anything." "Then explain it to me," I begged. She looked at me for a long moment before saying quietly, "A lot changed while you were gone." I stepped closer again and whispered, "But not us, right?" She didn't answer. That silence broke something inside me. I walked away before she could see tears forming in my eyes. I heard Richard say softly to her, "You shouldn't stress yourself." His voice sounded way too personal, way too comfortable. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the ring. I sat alone in the kitchen while my mother washed dishes quietly. Finally, I asked, "Mom, what happened to my marriage?" Her hands froze. She whispered, "I can't tell you." I slammed my fist softly against the table. Why is everyone hiding things from me? Tears filled her eyes immediately. She turned away so I wouldn't see her crying, but I already had. I stood up and said gently, "Mom, please, I deserve the truth." She shook her head. "Not tonight." I watched her leave the kitchen while wiping tears from her face. My chest felt painfully tight. I whispered to myself, "Whatever happened here destroyed this family." A few hours later, someone knocked on the front door. I opened it and saw my best friend Jake standing there. The moment he saw me, his expression changed completely. "Man, you really came back." I forced a weak smile. "Good to see you too." He stepped inside and looked around nervously before asking quietly, "Did anyone tell you yet?" My stomach twisted instantly. "Tell me what?" Jake rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Maybe I shouldn't be the one saying this." I grabbed his arm firmly. "Jake, stop talking in circles." He lowered his voice. "Something happened while you were deployed." "I already know that," I snapped. "Nobody acts normal around me anymore." Jake hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "People in town started talking months ago." My heart pounded violently. "Talking about who?" He looked directly into my eyes and whispered, "Emma and Richard." For a second, I honestly couldn't breathe. I stepped backward and laughed nervously. "That's impossible." Jake stayed silent. I shook my head repeatedly. "No, Emma would never do that to me. Richard is family." Jake looked miserable as he replied. I didn't want to believe it either. I felt anger rising inside me, but fear was even stronger. I whispered, "You're wrong. Everyone here is wrong." But deep inside, I already knew the truth was slowly tearing my life apart. I spent the entire next morning trying to convince myself Jake was wrong. I kept pacing around my room whispering, "Emma would never betray me. Richard would never destroy this family." But every time I remembered the ring on her finger and the way she avoided my touch, my chest tightened again. By evening, I finally heard voices downstairs. I walked slowly toward the living room, and the moment I stepped inside, I froze. Emma and Richard were sitting together on the couch like a normal couple. My mother stood near the window crying silently. I looked directly at Emma and asked, "Tell me the truth right now." She lowered her eyes and whispered, "Please don't make this harder than it already is." I laughed bitterly. "Harder? You think this can get harder?" Richard stood up and said calmly, "Sit down so we can talk like adults." I turned toward him immediately. "Don't speak to me like we're equals." Emma took a deep breath and finally said the words that destroyed me forever. "I'm engaged to Richard." For a second, the room disappeared around me. I honestly felt like the floor vanished beneath my feet. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh and say it was some terrible joke, but she didn't. I whispered weakly, "What did you just say?" She forced herself to look at me. "I'm marrying Richard." I shook my head slowly. No, no, you can't be serious." Richard stepped beside her proudly, placing his hand on her shoulder like he belonged there. That single movement made something inside me crack completely. I looked at him with disbelief and asked, "How could you do this to me?" He answered coldly, "Life moved on while you were gone." I laughed again, but this time my voice sounded broken. "You're my uncle." "And I'm also the man who stayed here," he replied. Emma stood up and said softly, "Please stop." I looked at her with tears burning in my eyes. "Stop? Emma, you are my wife." She crossed her arms tightly and whispered, "You were gone for 3 years." "I was serving my country," I shouted. Her voice suddenly became sharper. "And I was left alone every single day." I stared at her in shock. "So this is my fault now?" "No," she replied quietly, "but I needed someone stable." Those words hit me harder than any bullet ever could. "Stable?" I repeated. "I sent you letters every week. I called whenever I could. I survived hell just to come home to you." Emma looked away. Things changed. I felt my hand shaking violently. "Did any of my letters even matter to you?" She stayed silent. I took a step closer and whispered painfully, "I wrote to you every night. I told you how much I missed you. I carried your picture in my pocket through every mission." My voice cracked badly. "You promised you'd wait for me." Tears filled her eyes, but she still said nothing. Richard suddenly interrupted again. "Dragging this out won't help anyone." I looked at him with pure anger. "You stayed close to my wife while I was risking my life overseas." He crossed his arms and replied, "She came to me because she was lonely." I felt sick hearing those words. My mother suddenly cried out, "Please stop fighting." I turned toward her and asked quietly, "Mom, You knew about this? She covered her mouth and started sobbing harder. That answer alone destroyed the last hope I had left. I looked around the room and realized everyone already accepted this nightmare except me. Emma stepped toward me carefully. I never wanted to hurt you. I stared at her in disbelief. You're marrying my own uncle. Her voice trembled slightly. I didn't plan for this to happen. But you let it happen, I whispered. Nobody answered. The silence felt unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding painfully inside my chest. Every memory of Emma suddenly rushed through my mind at once. Our wedding day, her smile when I left for deployment, every promise we made before I boarded that military bus. I remembered writing letters late at night under dim lights while other soldiers slept nearby. I remembered kissing her photo before dangerous missions because believing in her gave me strength. I remembered telling everyone proudly, my wife is waiting for me back home. Now every single memory felt poisoned. I looked at Emma one final time and asked softly, did you ever love me at all? Tears rolled down her face as she whispered, I did. That makes this even worse, I replied. Richard moved closer to her protectively, and that sight completely shattered whatever remained inside me. I realized there was nothing left for me in that room anymore. No marriage. No loyalty. No home. Just betrayal. I wiped my face quickly before anyone could see me breaking apart completely. Then I turned around and walked toward the front door without another word. Behind me, I heard my mother crying loudly and Emma calling my name softly, but I didn't stop walking. Because if I stayed there even 1 second longer, I knew my heart would never survive it. I spent hours walking through empty streets that night, trying to understand how my entire life collapsed in a single conversation. Every memory in my head felt twisted now. Emma's smile, Richard's kindness, even the warmth of my own home suddenly felt fake. When I finally returned near sunrise, the house was completely silent. I stepped inside slowly and found my mother sitting alone at the kitchen table. Her eyes were swollen from crying. The moment she saw me, she whispered, "Thank God you came back." I stared at her coldly and replied, "Why? So everyone can lie to me again?" She lowered her head immediately. "Please don't speak to me like that." I laughed bitterly. How else should I speak to the woman who watched my marriage get destroyed? Tears rolled down her face instantly. I never wanted this to happen. But you knew, I snapped. She stayed silent. I stepped closer and asked again, "How long did you know about Emma and Richard?" Her hands trembled badly. "Almost a year." Hearing that answer felt like another knife through my chest. "A whole year?" I whispered. "And you never told me?" She cried harder. I tried to stop it. "How?" I shouted. "By staying quiet?" My voice echoed through the kitchen. I could barely control my breathing anymore. She stood up suddenly and said, "You don't understand how manipulative Richard became." I stared at her. "Then explain it to me." She wiped her tears and whispered, "After you left, he started helping Emma with everything. Bills, repairs, errands. He was always around." Her voice shook badly. "At first, I thought he was only supporting her because she missed you." I clenched my fists tightly. "But then," she continued softly, "he slowly pushed everyone else away. He made Emma depend on him." I felt sick listening to every word. "You should have called me," I said quietly. "I wanted to," she replied, "many times." "Then why didn't you?" She looked completely broken as she answered, "Because every time I tried, Emma begged me not to ruin things." I stared at her in disbelief. "Ruin things? I was her husband." "I know," my mother whispered. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I looked around the kitchen I grew up in and suddenly felt like a stranger inside my own home. Finally, I asked softly, "Did everyone know except me?" She hesitated before answering, most people suspected something. That answer completely destroyed the last piece of trust I had left. I backed away slowly and said, I fought for this family. My voice cracked painfully, and all of you watched me come home to humiliation. My mother reached for my hand. Please don't hate me. I pulled away immediately. I don't even know what I feel anymore. Before she could respond, my phone suddenly started ringing. I looked at the screen and saw Captain Harris calling. I walked outside before answering. Captain, I said weakly. His deep voice came through immediately. You sound terrible, son. I forced myself to stay calm. I'm fine. No, you're not, he replied firmly. I've heard broken men before. I stayed silent. After a few seconds, he asked quietly, What happened? I leaned against the porch railing and whispered, I lost everything. He didn't interrupt me, so I continued. My wife left me for my uncle. Even saying those words out loud felt unreal. Captain Harris sighed heavily. Damn. I rubbed my face and whispered, I survived war, Captain. But this, my voice broke, this feels worse. He answered carefully, Pain doesn't care whether it comes from bullets or betrayal. I closed my eyes tightly. Then he said firmly, But you're still a soldier. I laughed bitterly. That's the problem. Right now, I don't feel like a soldier. I swallowed hard before continuing. I feel like a broken husband. For a moment, he stayed quiet. Then he said, Strength isn't about never falling apart. It's about surviving after you do. I wanted to believe him, but everything inside me felt empty. After the call ended, I sat alone outside until Jake arrived later that afternoon. The moment he saw my face, he sighed and said, So you finally know everything. I nodded slowly. I still can't believe it. Jake sat beside me and muttered, Richard planned this carefully. I looked at him sharply. What do you mean? He's been controlling everything since you left, Jake explained. Your mother depended on him financially sometimes. Emma depended on him emotionally. People stopped questioning him because he always acted helpful. I felt anger burning inside my chest again. Jake continued, He even started acting like the head of your family. I stared at the ground silently. Then I asked quietly, Did Emma really love him? Jake hesitated before answering. I think she became emotionally trapped. That doesn't excuse betrayal, I replied coldly. No, Jake admitted. It doesn't. I clenched my fists again as rage slowly replaced the sadness inside me. But mixed with that anger was confusion. I didn't know whether to fight for my marriage, destroy Richard, or simply disappear from everyone forever. And honestly, that scared me more than anything else. The next few days felt like living inside someone else's life. I walked through my own house like a stranger while everyone acted carefully around me. Nobody mentioned Emma anymore, but I could feel her presence everywhere. Every room carried memories that now felt poisoned. What disturbed me most was Richard. I started watching him quietly instead of reacting emotionally. The more I observed him, the more uncomfortable I became. Everyone treated him like he owned the family already. My mother listened to every word he said. Workers around the property answered to him immediately. Even Emma followed him silently without questioning anything. One morning, I walked into the kitchen and heard Richard say, We'll handle the bank issue tomorrow. My mother nodded nervously. Whatever you think is best. The moment they saw me, both of them stopped talking. I leaned against the doorway and asked casually, What bank issue? Richard smiled calmly. Nothing important. I stared directly at him. Funny how everything becomes secret when I enter the room. He kept smiling, but I noticed tension in his eyes. You're imagining problems because you're emotional. I almost lost my temper hearing that, but I forced myself to stay calm. Instead, I replied quietly, Maybe. Emma walked into the kitchen seconds later. The moment she saw me, she immediately looked uncomfortable. She grabbed a cup of coffee without even saying good morning. I watched her silently before asking, "Are you really going to pretend I don't exist now?" She froze for a second but didn't face me. "I don't want more fighting." "That's not an answer," I replied. Richard suddenly stepped between us and said firmly, "Leave her alone." I looked at him coldly. "You seem very comfortable controlling conversations in my house." He crossed his arms. "Someone has to keep peace here." I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. Instead, I walked away quietly because I realized something important at that moment. Anger was exactly what Richard expected from me. If I exploded emotionally, everyone would call me unstable. Richard would look calm and reasonable while I looked broken. I finally understood why he kept provoking me. That realization changed something inside me. Later that afternoon, I decided to visit Daniel, the family lawyer. He had handled my father's legal matters before he died, and I trusted him more than almost anyone else. When I entered his office, he looked surprised. "I heard you came home." I sat down slowly and replied, "I wish I hadn't." He studied my face carefully before saying, "You look exhausted." "I found out my wife is engaged to my uncle," I answered flatly. Daniel sighed deeply. "I'm sorry." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I finally asked, "Has Richard been handling family business while I was gone?" Daniel hesitated too long before answering. "Some matters, yes." That hesitation immediately caught my attention. I leaned forward and asked quietly, "What aren't you telling me?" He adjusted his glasses nervously. "There are things I legally shouldn't discuss." My stomach tightened instantly. "Legally?" I repeated. Daniel rubbed his forehead before whispering, "Your father's will was updated recently." I froze completely. "Updated?" He nodded carefully. "Certain property arrangements changed." I stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. My father died years ago." Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I'm aware of that." "Then how can his will suddenly change?" He lowered his voice. "That's exactly why you should start paying attention." Every alarm inside my head immediately went off. I asked sharply, "Was Richard involved?" Daniel looked toward the office door before answering carefully, "I didn't say that." "But you're thinking it," I replied. He stayed silent. That silence told me everything. I stood up slowly and whispered, "Something illegal is happening in my family, isn't it?" Daniel avoided my eyes completely. "Be careful who you trust." Those words followed me all the way home. That evening, I sat alone outside when my neighbor Lily approached carefully. She looked nervous the moment she saw me. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Sure." She sat beside me and whispered, "I didn't know whether I should tell you this." My chest tightened immediately. "Tell me what?" Lily looked around before lowering her voice even more. "I saw Emma and Richard together months ago." I felt my jaw tighten painfully. "How together?" I asked quietly. "They were acting like a couple," she admitted. "At restaurants, stores, even late at night sometimes." I closed my eyes for a second. Lily continued carefully. "People started gossiping long before you came home." I looked at her and asked, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" She looked guilty. "Most people were afraid of Richard." That answer disturbed me deeply. When she left, I stayed outside alone for almost an hour thinking about everything. Emma's betrayal. Richard's control. The strange changes to my father's will. None of this felt accidental anymore. For the first time since returning home, my sadness slowly transformed into something colder and more focused. I finally whispered to myself, "No more emotional reactions." If Richard truly manipulated my family, then shouting wouldn't defeat him. I needed proof. I needed patience. And most importantly, I needed the truth before making my next move. I stopped reacting emotionally after my conversation with Daniel. The pain was still there, but something inside me had changed. Instead of asking why my life collapsed, I started asking how. And every answer seemed to lead back to Richard. For the next few days, I watched him carefully without letting him notice. I paid attention to his phone calls, the documents he carried, and the way everyone obeyed him immediately. The more I observed, the more obvious it became that he wasn't just controlling my family emotionally, he was controlling everything financially too. One afternoon, I noticed him leave the house carrying a black folder. The moment he drove away, I quietly entered his office downstairs. My heart pounded hard as I searched through drawers and cabinets. At first, I only found normal paperwork. Then I discovered a locked file box hidden behind old books. I whispered, "What are you hiding?" Using a small military tool from my bag, I forced the lock open carefully. The moment the lid lifted, my stomach tightened. Inside were financial records, property documents, and bank transfers connected to my father's estate. I sat down slowly and started reading. The deeper I looked, the worse everything became. Properties that belonged to my father had been transferred under Richard's authority. Accounts connected to family businesses were suddenly controlled by him. Some documents even carried signatures that didn't look real. I whispered in disbelief, "This can't be legal." Then I found something that made my blood run cold. A revised version of my father's trust. My hand shook badly as I read line after line. Somehow, Richard had inserted himself into financial control over nearly everything my father left behind. I remembered my father once telling me, "Never let greed enter this family." Now greed had completely poisoned it. I heard footsteps upstairs and quickly returned everything exactly where I found it before leaving the office quietly. That evening, Emma found me sitting alone outside near the porch. For a few seconds, she stayed silent before asking softly, "Can we talk?" I looked at her coldly. "Why now?" She sat down carefully beside me. "Because things have gotten worse since you came home." I laughed bitterly. "For me, yes." She looked hurt, but continued anyway. "I know you hate me." "I don't even know what I feel anymore," I admitted. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Richard helped me when I was struggling." I stared ahead silently while she continued. "After you left, everything became difficult. Bills, stress, loneliness." Her voice trembled slightly. "Your mother depended on Richard a lot, and eventually I did too." I finally looked at her. "So you fell in love with him?" She hesitated before answering, "It wasn't that simple." "Then explain it simply," I replied. Emma wiped tears from her eyes. "At first, he just listened to me. He made me feel safe when I was scared." She swallowed hard. "Then slowly, he became involved in every part of my life." I watched her carefully. "He always knew exactly what to say," she whispered. "If we argued, he blamed your absence. If I felt guilty, he said I deserved happiness." Something suddenly clicked inside my mind. I asked quietly, "Did he ever encourage you to reconnect with me?" She stayed silent too long. That silence gave me my answer. I leaned back slowly and whispered, "This wasn't just betrayal." Emma looked confused. "What?" "This was manipulation," I replied coldly. She immediately shook her head. "No, Richard loves me." "Does he?" I asked. "Or does he love control?" Emma looked shaken hearing those words. I stood up slowly and continued. "He isolated you emotionally while taking over my father's property financially." My voice became sharper. "You think those things happened separately?" She stared at me speechless. For the first time since returning home, I stopped feeling pure heartbreak. Instead, I finally saw the bigger picture clearly. Richard didn't just steal my wife. He stole my father's trust, my family's loyalty, and my place inside this house. And he did it patiently while I was gone. That realization changed me completely. Later that night, I met Jake at an old diner outside town. The moment I showed him copies of the financial documents I secretly photographed, his face turned pale. "Holy hell," he whispered. "This is serious." I nodded. Richard's been controlling my father's estate. Jake looked through the papers carefully. Some of these signatures look fake. That's exactly what I thought. Jake leaned closer and asked quietly, "What are you going to do?" I looked directly at him and answered calmly, "I'm done crying." For the first time in days, my voice sounded steady again. Jake studied me carefully before nodding. "Good." I took a deep breath and said, "I need proof strong enough to destroy him completely." Jake leaned back and replied firmly, "Then I'm helping you." I felt something unfamiliar return to me at that moment. Control. Not over my pain. Not over Emma. But over myself. And after everything Richard stole from me, that small feeling of control was enough to start fighting back. Over the next 2 weeks, my entire mindset changed. I stopped behaving like a wounded husband and started thinking like a soldier again. Every emotion became controlled, every reaction calculated. Richard noticed the difference immediately, even though he tried hiding his discomfort behind fake confidence. The more pressure we applied quietly, the more cracks appeared around him. Daniel became far more cooperative after I showed him the copied financial documents. We met secretly in his office late one evening, while rain hammered against the windows outside. He spread papers across the desk and whispered, "This is worse than I thought." I crossed my arms and asked, "How bad?" Daniel adjusted his glasses nervously. "Several property transfers violate your father's original trust agreement." He pointed toward one document. "And this signature is almost certainly forged." I stared at the papers silently. Daniel continued, "If this reaches court, Richard could face criminal charges." Hearing that should have made me feel victorious, but instead, I felt strangely calm. I asked quietly, "Can we prove everything?" Daniel nodded slowly. "With enough financial tracing, yes." I leaned forward and said firmly, "Then do it." For the first time since returning home, I finally felt like the situation was moving in my direction instead of Richard's. Later that night, Captain Harris called again. The moment I answered, he asked, "You sound different." "I am different," I replied. He stayed silent for a second before saying, "Good." I walked outside while speaking to him quietly. I finally stopped letting emotions control me. "That's survival," he answered firmly. I looked up at the dark sky and whispered, "I still feel angry." "You should," he replied. "But anger is dangerous when it controls you. A soldier survives by controlling it first." His words stayed with me. Then he added, "Pain either sharpens a man or destroys him." I thought about Richard manipulating my family while I was overseas. "I won't let it destroy me," I said quietly. Captain Harris laughed softly. "Now you sound like yourself again." After the call ended, I stood outside for several minutes realizing something important. Richard expected me to collapse emotionally forever. But instead, every betrayal had slowly rebuilt me into someone colder, calmer, and far more dangerous than before. The next morning, I finally confronted Emma again. This time, I wasn't emotional. I found her alone in the living room reading quietly. The moment she saw me, she looked nervous. "We need to talk," I said calmly. She slowly placed the book down. "About what?" "Everything." My calm voice clearly unsettled her more than anger ever had. I sat across from her and said quietly, "I know about the property transfers." Her face immediately lost color. I continued, "I know Richard manipulated my father's trust." I leaned forward slightly. "And I know he manipulated you too." Emma shook her head weakly. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly now," I replied. Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. It wasn't supposed to become this terrible. I stared at her without emotion, but it did. She covered her face while crying softly. I never wanted to hurt you. A few weeks earlier, hearing her cry would have shattered me completely. Now, I mostly felt exhausted. I asked quietly, did you ever stop to think what this would do to me? She whispered painfully, every day. Then why continue? Emma looked broken as she answered, because by the time I realized how trapped everything had become, Richard controlled too much. That answer confirmed everything I already suspected. I nodded slowly and said, you let him isolate you. He made me feel like I had nobody else, she admitted through tears. I stood up calmly. Emma looked at me desperately and whispered, do you hate me now? I thought about the question carefully before answering. I don't love you the same anymore. The pain on her face was immediate. But strangely, I felt almost nothing while saying it. That scared me more than anger ever had. As legal pressure quietly increased, Richard started changing too. His calm confidence slowly disappeared. I noticed him making nervous phone calls late at night. He became irritated whenever Daniel's name was mentioned. Even my mother began questioning him openly. One afternoon during lunch, she suddenly asked him, why are there so many changes involving your brother's estate? Richard froze briefly before replying, I handled things because nobody else could. I calmly added, or because nobody else knew what you were doing. The table went silent instantly. Richard looked directly at me and asked coldly, what exactly are you implying? I held his stare without fear. You already know. For the first time since my return, I saw genuine panic flicker across his face. It lasted only a second. But I noticed it. And so did everyone else. Jake later laughed quietly while we sat outside. He's terrified now. I nodded slowly. Good. Jake looked at me carefully before saying, you've changed a lot. I stared toward the house where Richard stood watching me through the window. Then I answered calmly, he created this version of me himself. And judging by the fear growing in his eyes, Richard was finally realizing the broken man he betrayed no longer existed anymore. The final collapse happened 3 days later. Daniel arrived at the house carrying a folder full of financial records and forged documents. Jake stood beside me while my mother sat nervously at the table. Richard walked in confidently, but the moment he saw Daniel, his expression changed. What is this? He asked sharply. I looked directly at him and said calmly, the truth. Daniel opened the folder and spread the papers across the table. These documents prove illegal property transfers connected to your brother's estate, he explained. Several signatures are fake. My mother gasped softly. Emma stared at the papers with shaking hands. Richard immediately snapped. That's a lie. Daniel replied calmly. A handwriting specialist already confirmed the fraud. For the first time, Richard looked afraid. Emma turned toward him slowly. You told me everything was legal. Richard hesitated. Emma, listen to me. No, she whispered. Did you manipulate me too? The room fell silent. I stepped forward and said quietly, he manipulated everyone. My mother suddenly started crying. You destroyed this family. Richard shouted angrily. I was trying to hold this family together. You stole from this family? I answered coldly. Emma backed away from him with tears running down her face. I gave up my marriage for you. Richard stayed silent. That silence answered everything. Jake crossed his arms and muttered, looks like your little empire is over. Daniel closed the folder slowly. Legal action may follow after this. Richard looked completely broken now. The powerful man who controlled everyone was finally exposed. Then Emma walked toward me carefully. I'm sorry, she whispered. I made the worst mistake of my life. I looked at her quietly. Some mistakes change everything forever. She lowered her head and cried harder. My mother grabbed my hand. Please don't leave. I slowly looked around the house one final time. Every memory inside it felt painful now. This place doesn't feel like home anymore, I said softly. Richard glared at me angrily. So you think you won? I picked up my bag and answered calmly. No, I just survived. Nobody spoke after that. I walked toward the front door slowly, while silence filled the house behind me. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel victorious. I only felt free. Before leaving completely, I stopped near the porch and whispered, I hope one day all of you learn how to live with the truth. Then I walked away without looking back. Because real strength wasn't revenge. Real strength was rebuilding myself after everything had been destroyed.